Knife hinges are a great low-profile option for a cabinet. They stay out of the way so you can focus on the beauty of the wood and the beauty of the design. On a cabinet like this one that has an inset door, you need what's called an offset knife hinge. It's L-shaped. That allows the door to open up and swing free of the cabinet. The only trouble with knife hinges is that they can be a little tricky to locate accurately. And if you get them a little bit off, the door's not going to open properly. That's why it's smart to make a routing template for the mortises. You're guaranteed to get all four perfectly located, and the door will not only look great, it'll open and close great too. This jig is really easy to make. It's got a plywood base and a hardwood fence. The base has two slots in it, and they're 90 degrees to one another, just like the two legs on an offset knife hinge. I'll put a bushing like this one on my router. It fits perfectly into the slots and guides the router through the cut. This jig is also reversible, and that allows me to route all four mortises with just one jig. There'll be a straight bit in the router that's sized perfectly to allow me to route the mortise in a single pass. So let me show you how it's made. Start with a piece of plywood that's large enough to accommodate your router. Cut a shallow groove on each side of the plywood so they line up perfectly with each other. The way to do this is to first run the groove on one side, then flip the piece end for end and run the groove on the second side with the same edge of the board against the fence. These grooves act as a reference point for the fence. Then make the fence to fit perfectly into the groove. Now lay out the oversized mortise on the template. Start by putting the hinge leaf on the template. Half of the hinge pin needs to be into the groove. Once you have it there, put a tick mark that represents the back of the hinge. Now use a combination square to transfer that line down along the template. After calculating the offset for your bushing, measure that distance back from the first line and draw a second line. Now measure forward to get the other side of the oversized mortise. Use a combination square to draw both of those lines down the template and then transfer them onto the edge of the template. Now draw a line perpendicular to the first set of lines you drew. This represents one end of the oversized mortise. Measure over the diameter of your bushing and draw a second line. That's it. Transfer those lines down to the edge of the template. Now measure for the overall length of the two legs of the template. The leg for the long section of the hinge needs to be accurate. But the leg for the short side of the hinge doesn't. In fact, make it longer than necessary to give you a place to start the router. Finally, extend those lines over to the edges of the template. You'll need them when you set up the router table. At the router table, set the bit height. It should be just a bit taller than the thickness of your template. Next, set the distance from the fence to the bit. Use the lines on the edge of your template to do this. Use the line on the template that represents the end of the slot to set a start block on the fence. You'll use this block to ensure that when you begin the cut, the bit is cutting exactly at the end of the slot. With the router on, put the edge of the template against the start block and lower the template onto the bit. When the bit has come all the way through, push the template through the bit until you reach the other end of the slot. Then turn the router off as you hold the template in place. Setting the fence for the second slot is pretty easy. Put the template over the bit and then pull the fence up until it touches the edge of the template. Lock it in place. Hold the template in place with a push pad and then turn the router on. Push the template through the bit until you reach the end of the slot. Remember, this slot is a lot longer than it needs to be. It gives us a place to start the router and start the cut. Just like before, wait for the bit to come to a complete stop before you move the template away from it. Back of the bench, use 2 screws to attach the fence. We're just about ready to start routing mortises. First thing you need to do is set the depth of the bit. To do that, put the template onto the router base and the hinge leaf onto the template. Then set it by feel. Now clamp the template to a piece of scrap and route a test mortise in it. One of the reasons to do a test mortise before you start routing into your cabinet is that when you do, you're going to route a slot through the fence, and that becomes a reference mark. You can align it with layout lines on your cabinet, and you'll know precisely where the bit's going to cut. Now, another reason to do a test mortise is that you can actually put the hinge in it and make sure everything's working properly. I'm going to square mine up now and get that test fit in. That fits great, and that means we can start routing the cabinet. Now, in order to lay them out, all we really need to do is make one layout line for each mortise. We want to know how far the mortise is from the edge of the cabinet. In order to know that, we need to know the distance between the 2 hinge leaves. It's that gap between them that determines the gap between the door and the cabinet. It should be equal all the way around. To know the gap, I took some cardboard, added some tape to it until it was the exact distance or thickness between the 2 hinge leaves. Now I can take it, put it against the side of the cabinet, and make a pencil mark, and that shows me where the end of my mortise should be. All right, I've marked both mortise locations. I'm going to take the cabinet apart and then route them. Put the template on the workpiece and align the notch in the fence with the layout line on your workpiece. That guarantees the mortise will be in the right place. Then clamp the template down. Now just route the mortise. The bit's depth is already set, so all you have to do is put the router in place, turn it on, route forward, and then to the side. It doesn't take long to square up the mortise, so I go ahead and do the first one after I've routed it and before I route the second one. To route the second mortise in the cabinet, take the fence off and put it around on the other side of the template. Then route a new test mortise to create a new kerf in the fence that you can line up with the mark on your workpiece. From there, it's just like making the first mortise. Put the template in place, aligning it with your layout line, clamp it, route, and then square up the mortise. Well, the 2 mortises in the cabinet are done. That means we can glue the cabinet up and fit the door. And after that, we'll route the mortises in the door. After the cabinet's dry, go ahead and fit the door. You want to aim for an even gap on all 4 sides. I'm using that taped cardboard that I used earlier as shims. It's a little tight there. Routing the mortise in the door is just like routing the mortise in the cabinet, with one difference. The edge of the hinge should be flush with the edge of the door. So when you put the template on the door, line up the edge of that groove in the template's fence with the edge of the door. There aren't any layout lines to worry about. For the second mortise on the door, start by flipping the fence on the template to the other side. Line it up with the edge of the door, clamp it in place, route, square up the mortise with a chisel, and after you've got the hinge fitting good, go ahead and pre-drill those holes. All right, everything's ready now. We can install the door and see how well it fits. All right, there you go. Perfectly fit knife hinges and a perfectly fit door.